Welcome to our discussion in the books of Thessalonians, and particularly 2 Thessalonians. We've arrived at chapter 2. We've been talking about the passage in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, where Paul speaks of the Antichrist. I'm Anthony Buzzard, speaking to you from Atlanta Bible College, where we teach the Bible in a classroom setting and prepare our pastors to help others in the pastoral ministry, through their pastoral ministry, to help others on the journey that leads to the kingdom of God, the object of the Christian faith. In chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians, Paul mentions the man of lawlessness who has to appear before the coming of Jesus. And I was referring, just before we completed our last segment, to the passages in Daniel where Paul got his information. Let me read, if I may, from Daniel 7 and verse 25. This is one of the key passages in regard to the Antichrist. Now, if you're a keen student of the Bible, I will invite you to read the entire 7th chapter of Daniel, a most important blueprint for the whole biblical scheme. But in verse 25, Paul clearly found interesting material here about the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness. Daniel 7:25 says, "He will speak out against the Most High." And the he here is obviously a single individual, a wicked person, described in the vision as a little horn, a little political figure, in fact, and he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints. He'll be, in other words, in opposition to the Christian faith. He'll wear down the saints. The saints, I have to tell you in the Bible, are not some special class of Christians, but all believers, all true believers in Jesus, who've been baptized, who've received the gospel and received the Spirit of God. These are the saints, as we see here in prophecy. Well, this anti-Christian figure is going to wear down the saints. He's going to oppress them. He's going to harass them. And he will intend to make alteration in times and in law. It isn't entirely clear what this means, but he's going to attempt to alter the structure of society, perhaps in terms of the calendar. He's going to reorganize things in a new way that suits him. And not only that, the saints will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. A brief period of time we're looking at here. A brief period of oppression and tribulation for the saints at the end of the age. And apparently then the Antichrist is somehow going to overcome the saints. Some of them will actually be martyred. Others will be driven to escape in various places in order to avoid the oppression of the Antichrist. Anyway, this is the verse 7:25, where Paul found information about the Antichrist, and it's exactly that portrait that he develops in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Chapter 8 of Daniel, and again in verse 25, we read this, "And through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease, and he will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human hand, without human agency." Don't you see there a very clear picture then of Paul's Antichrist, the Antichrist picture that he develops in 2 Thessalonians 2. Here's an individual who is full of deceit, who is opposing the saints, as we saw in 7:25 of Daniel, who is opposing, in fact, the Prince of Princes, Jesus himself. But this person is going to be supernaturally broken, supernaturally destroyed. And this tells us, of course, that his end, the destruction of the Antichrist, will be at the hands of the returning Jesus, who will destroy him supernaturally. And then Daniel 7 or 8:26 speaks of this vision being for many days in the future, as it was indeed when Daniel wrote it in the 6th century BC. It's for a time even lying ahead of our own period at the beginning of the 2000s. And then finally in Daniel 11, verse 36, a most interesting description of the Antichrist. Again, I invite you to read the whole context here. You know, a very good principle of Bible study is to realize this, that when the New Testament writers select a given verse from the Old Testament, they intend us to read the entire context of that verse. It isn't sufficient just to read the one verse that they quote, but we should be absorbed with the context of that verse as it's found in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. So in Daniel 11:36, we read of the king, and this king is going to do as he pleases, and he's going to exalt and magnify himself above every god, and he will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. There you have the clearest description of the final anti-Christian figure. If you remember those words there about exalting himself above every god, look back then to 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, where we read of the Antichrist opposing and exalting himself above every so-called god. You see clearly then the echo of that Old Testament passage in the words of Paul here. Now, this individual, according to 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, is going to take his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Now, this is an extraordinary event. Here comes some extraordinarily proud individual who's going to claim divinity in some sense and take up a position in the temple of God itself. It would appear from this text that there has to be a physical temple rebuilt, and that's what many students of Bible prophecy believe. The evidence for this would not only be the words of Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, but also in Daniel 11 and verse 31. In the very same context from which we were just reading about the Antichrist who exalts himself, you will find a reference there to the same king of the north in Daniel 11:31, who opposes or attacks the temple fortress. And that sounds like a real building of bricks and mortar, a temple not in the figurative or spiritual sense, but in a literal sense of a building. And so in that context, where Paul refers to the temple, he's not probably referring to the church as the temple, although in other passages he did, but in this particular context, with reference to Daniel 11:31, in all likelihood, he has a real temple building in mind. And so one would expect then a temple to be rebuilt at some stage. Of course, nobody is setting dates. We don't know the chronology of these events. But when that does happen, we should expect then an evil ruler to establish himself in some kind of very elevated authority as being God, sitting in the temple. Paul then says in verse 5, "Don't you remember that while I was still with you, I used to tell you these things?" Do you realize that Paul, when he founded a church, gave the disciples a complete rundown, a complete account of the detail of Antichrist, even within the short time that Paul was with them, probably about 3 or 4 weeks in this case, when he founded the churches in Thessalonica. But Paul thought this anti-Christian material was so important that he says, "Don't you remember that I used to tell you about these things when I was with you?" So we invite you to explore with us in ongoing segments then the rest of this chapter. But for the moment we leave you then with this anti-Christian material in mind. And please join us again as we continue our investigation verse by verse of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2.